A round of applause for her again. Kara is like a sustainability phenomenon right there, to be able to sustain herself through all of this days. And all of you too. Here we are toward the end of the week. All that stands between you and me is a party. Well, I stand between you and a party. And you know, I've been a lot of places. This is my 35th year as a journalist, basically trying to make the case for nature, whether it's acting on climate change or the work I did in the Amazon rainforest, writing about the murder of Chico Mendes and the issue over the future of the rainforest. It's been a long journey, and every day I wake up feeling like it's a new journey, because those of you, everyone here is got that same passion, and you've seen so many examples, fantastic examples of experimentation in trying to make information matter, whether it's data or a great image. And that's the challenge of our time. You know, we've had some great experiences here at this watering hole. It feels like a watering hole to me here, just like the day-to-night photos. And you are all here. This is probably the highest concentration of people on the planet right now whose passion is making a case for nature. And then you're going to disperse from here back out into the field. And I know you all have the same feeling I do, which is we're immersed in information and imagery. And the challenge in our media environment right now is, how do you cut through the noise? We had a session a few days ago on that. And everything I did on .earth at the New York Times, everything I'll be doing here now that I'm here, is framed around how do we cut through the noise? How do you become the signal, as I said at the media workshop the other day? Be the signal. So there's still these great challenges with all these tools, and we're going to talk about that here. So it's too much information, great imagery. How do you move it to the next level? How do you make the case for nature translate into change on this crowding planet that will still have wildlife on it later this century, hopefully, and a smooth human journey? We're going to have that discussion. And I get pretty bummed out sometimes. I sort of had this diurnal cycle. I wake up excited. I imagine some of you have this too, where you sort of go to sleep, oh my God. And you wake up again. I don't know anyone here of any age that I've met who isn't the kind of person who wakes up in the morning saying, let's do it again better. And my hope amid all this morass comes from some things that have happened in my life that aren't about me telling a better story. And I want to show you one example from 10 years ago. I have two sons, both of whom, for some reason or other, want to go into communication. One of them is already working in visual effects and films. The other one is a VU sophomore. But 10 years ago, we were in Florida, and in a very crowded suburban part of Florida, and Jack had the camera, and we went to go check out an area where we had paddled a boat a couple days earlier. And so here's Jack, and here's some hope. Good morning. We're in Stuart, Florida. It's April 22nd, Earth Day. It's like the 38th Earth Day. And I'm rowing with my son Jack to go see some birds that we saw yesterday up a little mangrove creek here in the middle of Florida-style suburban sprawl. Which is a lot of houses on a lot of little waterways.
This is close up in the mangroves. See if we can spot any animals. Whoa, there it goes. Well, that was amazing. It looked like a statue.
First spot.
Yep.
Let's see what else is coming.
Spot where we saw tri-colored heron babies. Let's see if we can spot them again.
Oh, here.
Those are the babies. Oh, yes, there they are, there they are. Move back, move back.
Okay.
I just saw one. Move over a little, I can't see it. Can't see it. Just move in like that. Hello, little birdies. Yes, 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 it's on the camera.
Okay.
That's a baby tri-colored heron. They are cute.
So, so that tells me that handing a camera to a kid or this is a great example of a digital actual interplay. You know, it's a hybrid experience, and he has those memories in his head. That went on my blog, got 10,000 or so views on YouTube. And you know, I didn't encourage my kids to get into communication. In fact, probably gently discouraged them, but he's at BU, a sophomore in film and communication. So whether it changed him in a way that could change others is to be determined. But there are 4 people who are going to come out now. We're going to have a sprightly discussion of other ways to think about how to make progress in making communication matter on this crowding planet. And here comes Steve Ramirez, Emma Marris, Julia Lee, and David Doubilet. So we're going to go through this quickly. There's an amazing array of talent here. And we have to start with the brain, because everything you're thinking and reacting to right now is a function of this couple pounds of cerebral matter in there. And if you don't understand that ecosystem, how can we understand the rest of the global ecosystem? So Steve is a BU, newly moved to BU, where you have a lab, a neuroscience lab. And can you take us into the internal environment so we can do a better job protecting the external one?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
Alrighty. So when most of us think of Nat Geo, we usually think of taking cameras and then pointing them out into the world and taking pictures of everything in the world and the vast cosmos, right? I take the kind of specialized cameras that we use and flip it around and image the vast ecosystems that exist in our brain. So my lab studies learning and memory, and the goal of the lab is to artificially manipulate memories to see what that tells us about the brain, and then ideally to do so in a therapeutic context, right? So in this case, we study an area of the brain called the hippocampus. You have 2 of them. They're right above your ears, tucked inwardly. And it's an area of the brain that, when it's damaged, produces amnesia. So like Dory and Finding Nemo probably had hippocampus damage. In this case, Matt Damon, for instance, in the Bourne trilogy, probably had hippocampus damage, or just Matt Damon in general. And in this case, I'm from Boston, so I'm not allowed to say that. But in this case, what we do is we develop techniques in the lab to find the brain cells that hold on to one particular memory, and then we trick the brain cells to glow a particular color, and in this case, green. And on top of that, we get those cells to respond to brief pulses of light so that we can stick an optic fiber in the brain and shoot light into the brain and reactivate a memory. So what you're looking at here is a cross-section of the hippocampus, and these are cells that hold on to a positive memory, and we trick them to glow green. It's my favorite image I've ever taken because memory feels ephemeral and like something that we can't touch, but you're visualizing right now the crystallization of a particular memory in the brain. We can do this with negative memories also. So we can trick the brain cells in the hippocampus that hold on to one memory to glow this weird cyan avatar color. And in this case, this is with regards to a negative memory. So I'm going to start off with a negative memory, not because we're like evil scientists in white coats, but because we know that negative memories are intimately tied with disorders like anxiety and PTSD. So can we manipulate memories to try to alleviate symptoms associated with those? So with negative memories, we start off in this case, we start off in rodents. And the way a mouse, for instance, in this case, displays a negative memory is that it'll kind of go to a corner, it'll stay still, and it'll remain just vigilant, it'll be immobilized. So we call that freezing behavior because the animal looks as though it's freezing in place. We study freezing in this case because it's a remarkably evolutionarily conserved behavior. Like right now, for instance, if we were to hear a super loud noise, most of us would probably tense up, right? We would freeze. Or if your name happens to be Steve Ramirez and you go to a bar in DuPont Circle and you accidentally run into an ex-girlfriend and you realize that that's the reason why you wanted to erase memories in the brain to begin with, in this hypothetical situation, Steve Ramirez might freeze. And then, I promise you I'm over it, so stop asking me that I'm not over it, because I'm over it. So you're better, not me. So, so in this case, in this video, the first half is important because this animal does not have a fear memory. We're just going to shoot light into the brain and then see if it freezes or not. It's a control experiment. We want to make sure that shooting the light, as you can see, doesn't make it freeze. The brain doesn't have any pain receptors, so it doesn't hurt the animal in any way. So that's good that nothing happens in this case. Now, in the second half, this animal does have a fear memory, and the brain cells that hold on to this particular memory are susceptible now to being activated by light, and when we shoot light into the brain, the animal freezes. So we can do this with positive memories too. And again, we started off with negative memories just because it's binary, right? The animal's either moving or not. So people often ask, like, what does it feel like when you artificially manipulated a memory in the brain for the first time, right? I could imagine it's like when an ocean explorer sees, dives deep in the ocean and sees something looking back at them that they've never seen before, or discovering a new species. Now, for me, my honest response was like, I didn't really have any words to describe what it means to actually take a video of reactivating a memory. I just rely on cat GIFs. And in this case, this is just how I felt. I'm like, you're this bloated cat just excited by what you just saw. And it conveys a lot of human emotion, so. But okay, to what end, right? Imagine, we can ask these questions now, and it's what the lab is working on. Like, we can go into the brain and take images of memories. Imagine being able to turn on positive memories. You can see the brain cells holding on to a positive memory here in green. Imagine being able to reactivate those and alleviate symptoms associated with depression. Imagine being able to turn off negative memories, seen here in red, and being able to prevent the return of fear in cases like anxiety and PTSD, right? I do think that now we're living in a time where we can go in and actually monitor this ecosystem of memories as seen here and their interplay in the brain. And then the brain is what helps us perceive the world and make sense of it, right? So that's why, for me personally at least, the case for nature, in my opinion, begins in the brain. Thank you.
Great. So I got to quickly ask you, though, I mean, there's a downside to what I'm looking at there, too. If you think about this in the context of what Jaron Lanier and others have written recently about this social media, and the folks are programming these, the algorithms designed to hook us. The downside, the fear reflexes are like instant, and the relaxation and the more sort of engagement part is slow. Are we doomed, or is there a way forward?
Well, we're not doomed because we have Nat Geo, right?
Yes.
So, no, I mean, it is true, right, that you can create algorithms that are more likely to tap into your brain's fear or reward systems for that matter. And then I think that, the way that we consume this kind of media, the way that we consume anything really has to be in moderation, right? Being on social media for 24 hours a day probably isn't healthy. Yeah. But there's the flip side, right? Because if there is a narrative that unfolds on everybody's social media stream, for instance, the narrative could either be doom and gloom, which I'm an eternal optimist, so I don't buy that narrative, but it could be positive, right? Because I mean, the images that we're about to see also of whether it's conservation or what happens when we try to save nature, I think that those images can stick, right? They become a Nat Geo cover, and then when that sticks, then I think that can tap into our brains' like reward and empathy systems, and then make us care, I think, that much more, which I hope is the upside.
Right, and we have this army of people who are willing to get out there and experiment, get at the upside of things. Mm-hmm. Emma Marris, I first became aware of your work as journalist to journalist through your book Rambunctious Garden, which was a fantastic prod to the conservation community to asking really important questions about what is nature in this Anthropocene epoch that we're in. And like that scene in Florida, there's a young boy who found in the middle of a suburban sprawl a little nook, and then within that nook a little moment. So can you explain a little bit about how you got focused on this new sense of nature and where you're going from there?
Okay, sounds good. So yeah, as Andy mentioned, I'm an environmental journalist. When I tell people that at parties, they tend to get a slightly panicked look in their eye and back away. And I think that's because they expect me to then depress the hell out of them for the rest of the evening. They think that that's my job as an environmental journalist, is to be super depressing. And I think that kind of overarching narrative about the environment is a little dangerous. So back in 1989, Gallup poll was conducted, and 76% of Americans described themselves as an environmentalist. And in 2018, that figure is down to 42%. So people are not describing themselves as environmentalists anymore, and I think a big reason behind that is that they're burned out. They're just overwhelmed by climate change, by extinction. You hear talk about like the 6th mass extinction, just sort of relentless negative stories. And I understand why people feel this really important urge to tell those negative stories and to get that out there. These horrible things are happening and something must be done right away. But I think that if we just lay on the negative and we never bring in the positive, we never bring in hope, we never bring in potential solutions, we really do run a well-documented, sort of empirically backgrounded risk of burning people out. And then they just check out. You know, they go to sort of escapism. They go to reality television and bourbon and all the other things that we go to when we just can't handle the reality. So when I decide what kind of stories I'm going to cover, I always ask myself where is the hope in this? Where is the path forward? Who are the people who are tackling this? What are the possible solutions? And I try to, you know, allocate as much of my word count to the solutions and to the hope as I do to the description of the problem. And I think that this is especially important when we talk about children. So I'm also a mother. One of these two little blondies is mine. And I really take heart the lesson of David Doubilet, who's an education professor, who said, no tragedies before 4th grade. So that's when kids are around 10. And I think that's about right. I think that's about the age when we can start talking to them about climate change and glaciers melting and how many tigers are left in the wild. But what I worry about is when we actually lead with that. And my own kids have been taught about Amazonian deforestation before they know where the Amazon is. And many kids learn about climate change before they learn the names of the trees on the block where they live. And I really deeply feel like you have to love something before you can care for it. And if the first thing you learn about nature is that it's doomed and that it's far away, it doesn't have anything to do with you, then you're not going to create that connection. You're going to sort of protect yourself emotionally by preemptively deciding that you're not going to be a nature person because it's all going away. So I think to combat that, we need to do two things. We need to tell these more hopeful stories, but we also need to just get kids in particular, but all of us really, back into connection with the nature that we've got at hand. And here's where I come down a little bit on National Geographic, because National Geographic makes such beautiful, beautiful images of the natural world that we can sometimes be trained by these images to not notice the scrappy little nature that's nearby, the street trees or the parakeets in London or the clover on the play field when we're playing soccer. I'm actually working with Charlie on the rat story. So there's a story where we're going to be talking about some very nearby nature. It's very nearby to all of us right now. We could probably all find a rat in the next half an hour if we really wanted to. So, you know, I wrote this whole book, Rambunctious Garden, that asked people to expand their notion of what counts as nature. But I was still, in my heart, doing that purism thing and looking for those big, beautiful natures. And I still love going to those kinds of places and writing those kinds of stories. But even years after my book came out, I was still ripping all the dandelions out of my yard until my own daughter asked me why on earth I was killing the most beautiful and earliest blooming flowers in the entire garden. So this year, I have actually finally done it, and I have stopped pulling out all my dandelions, and I've stopped mowing the backyard, and it is turning into a wilderness back there. I'm not sure I'll be able to find my children when I go home. So I think this kind of thing is just so important for all of us. Remember, when you're on your way to your field site that's halfway around the world and that's completely remote and filled with enormous, fascinating megafauna, to stop and remind yourself, what are the trees that grow on my street? What are the little bugs in my own back garden? Because nature is there too. And if we don't learn to love it at home, we're never going to be able to summon up the collective will to protect it all around the world. Thanks.
Bravo. So I have to stress that Emma is one of our inaugural media innovation fellows and heading off into new adventures as a result of that. Can you just give a quick glimpse forward?
Yeah, I'm going to be writing a bunch of stuff, projects about animal conservation. And I'm going to be looking at some of the tricky trade-offs between animal welfare and animal conservation. So some of this is going to be less sort of bouncy and optimistic, perhaps, but I think that it will be nuanced. And if there's a point to say along with the idea that we shouldn't shy away from hope and optimism, is that we should also trust our readers to be able to handle a little bit of complexity and nuance. We can tell them that not everything is going to hell in a handbasket, and that's not going to confuse them. They are capable of understanding a more complex picture. So I'll be working a lot about animal conservation stories and trying to, in a way, find the role of our compassion and empathy within conservation.
Fantastic. So Julia Lee, taking the step from the brain to the global experience that Emma's talking about with nature through your work now. You study the behavior of organizations and individuals in the context of messaging and the like at University of Michigan. And let's hear from you on this question of what could make the case for nature. What is the case for nature? We were talking earlier about how much of it is the economic question versus the aesthetic question or the ethical question. So just let's hear from you.
All right, thank you, Andy. All right, hi everyone, good afternoon. I'm very, very excited about this particular opportunity, so hang in there. So as a behavior scientist, I explore the human mind. I study two things. One is psychology of narratives, the power of stories that we tell ourselves and that we tell others. I also study the psychology of morality and ethics. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about how psychological insights can be leveraged and can be a powerful tool for changing people's hearts and minds. So there are, as Andy said, there are two different ways that you can communicate the value of nature, the natural world. One way of doing it is to talk about it in terms of economic terms, or you can talk about it as a moral choice, right? And in recent years, I have noticed that there is this increasing trend that people are talking about nature in terms of natural capital. And so, as you can see in this image, there are a lot of numbers, and this kind of image can picture nature as a numbers game in a cost-benefit analysis. And so I was wondering if this might be the most effective way of communicating nature such that people can be motivated to act or not, right? So that was my biggest question here. And I'm going to present some research evidence that tells a quite different story. So what's in the name? This is a prisoner's dilemmas game. It's often taught in the economics class. It's a hypothetical game, but it's used to demonstrate the fact that people tend not to cooperate nearly enough, even when it is beneficial to cooperate, because they're worried about being taken advantage by other people. And so people just don't cooperate enough. And the researchers at Stanford University wanted to change that a little bit by driving the behavior by changing the name of the game. So they recruited a lot of participants, and one group of participants were told that they will be playing the game called the community game. And the other group of participants, guess what? It's called Wall Street game. So as you can imagine, it does have certain connotations. And what they found is that when people were led to believe that they are playing the community game, they were much more likely to cooperate than when they were told that they are playing the Wall Street game. So this research tells us the power of language in driving our behavior, such as cooperation, which is an important behavior for conservation effort. Another example comes from another research showing that the power of economic schemas. So in this study, participants were asked to complete a sentence scrambling task. And in this task, some participants were given economic vocabulary to use, like profit, cost, benefit, et cetera, and some participants did not receive these economic vocabulary, but were told to use neutral words. And then they were told that they're going to communicate some bad news to students who are about to lose their scholarships. And eventually what they found here is that triggering economic schema reduced the participants' compassion and empathy significantly as compared to people who are not triggered the economic schema. So there is this general sense that thinking about issues in economic terms may be a little bit harmful. And it's not just about economic terms, but just merely triggering money images or reminding people of money can do a lot of harm as well, in the sense that people may cheat more and they may reduce helping, care, and warmth, all of which are important values and behaviors that we're here to promote. And so to summarize this research, it all shows that talking and communicating about nature in an academic terms may be useful under certain circumstances, but sometimes it may do more harm than help. So where do we go from here? And I wanted to find some answer in the research as well. And I'm going to show you some images. So this one is nature, or the earth as described as non-human. And the right side of the image describes nature as human. So as you can see, there are a set of eyes, and there are some expressions, facial expressions and emotions that are very human-like traits. Right? Those people who described nature in the second way were more likely to emotionally connect with nature, and therefore they were also more likely to support the conservation effort. So this is just one example of how research can be utilized and leveraged to create stronger emotional connections. And I do believe that it is our responsibility to craft better messages and better narratives to connect humans better with nature. And so, it is my hope that the future generations can expand their moral circle to include nature and non-human animals in their ambit of concern. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It sounds like there's a grant-making priority here right now on making the case for nature, and I think they should rope you in too for some advice. And it sounds like you might end up interviewing Julia for your book, from what I can tell, as well. Just to keep things moving forward, David Doubilet, I think I've been at this a while. There's always someone who's further down the road than everyone. There may be someone for you too, I'm not sure. So 50 years, half a century or more of photography, what lessons have you learned that you can carry forward for the next decades of your adventure? Come on up.
There's a constant hum here, and it's the E.O. Wilson hum, which means that if you want to protect nature, you first have to love it. And if you want to love it, you first have to understand it. But there's something else too. You first have to see it. And that's what I've been working on for the last 50 years underwater. It's that simple. I have a kind of a longer view of the ocean and how it's changed and how we can protect it. There's some mistakes we've made. There's some victories we've had. Let me show you a few things. The pictures have power, and they have the power. They have the power to celebrate, and they have the power to humiliate, and they certainly have the power to illustrate, and they have the power to convince the unconvinced. And they also have the power, this is the power that Jennifer Hayes and I, my partner, have. They have the power to open people's eyes to the sea. Here's a few examples of some success that we've had over the years in protecting segments of the greatest part of our planet. Look at this. This is North Sound in Grand Cayman Island. And in the mid-'80s, fishermen used to clean their catch there. And the stingrays, southern stingrays, used to come in and eat the catch. And then divers, around 1986, began to feed the stingrays. In 1987, I came down and I did a story on a place that they then called Stingray City. There was 6 stingrays there. Now, there's 106 stingrays there. And last year, 750,000 people went to see them. They are the ambassadors of the ocean. Stingrays in the Cayman Islands, along with sharks, are now permanently protected. That is, I consider, a victory. Story we did, Jennifer and I did, with the late Peter Benchley, who was the author of Jaws. Story in the Great White Shark. This is photographed in a place called Hansbaai in South Africa. After the story came out, basically what it did is it put, and this is a quotation from Wilfred, our friend Wilfred Stiefel in Hansbaai, it put Hansbaai on the map. Again, 88,000 people 2 years ago came to see great white sharks. Great white sharks have been protected. They have been protected from the early 90s onward, but this cements that relationship for the penultimate predator on our planet. But sharks generally, across the whole spectrum of the ocean, are not doing so well. And this is because of rising economic wealth in China and the desire for shark fin soup. Vigo is the main port for all of Europe. These are blue sharks. For every swordfish that comes in, 15 blue sharks die. There used to be mountains of these sharks. They're now mounds of the sharks. This is one trawler's worth of sharks. And the bigger question is, how does this system work? Not only are the sharks dying, but we don't know how the entire system of the open ocean in the Grand Banks, the richest fishing ground, works if we can have that many blue sharks. This is something we need to find out and something we need to see. There are successes. In the Bahamas is now a shark sanctuary. And strangely enough, the driving force behind it was underwater photographers coming to see sharks. Sharks are more valuable as living creatures than they are as things on the table. And there's been failures. Futo, the port in Japan, where I photographed, has had a dolphin slaughter. This is in the mid-'80s. I photographed this dolphin slaughter, and what happens is 200 dolphins were driven into the port. They were pulled up into a net. Their carotid arteries were sliced. The dolphins swam around. In 3 minutes, they bled out and died, and the sounds came up through my feet. I brought these pictures back to the magazine in mid-'80s, and they couldn't be published because the editorial and the editor felt that then it was simply too graphic. Now, maybe a difference. It might have made a difference. We're working on coral reefs now, and coral reefs are ultimately the greatest biodiversity in the ocean. And to make a picture like this, you have to almost transcend the needs of a story. This is in a place called Kimby Bay. It is ultimately beautiful, but coral reefs suffer right now. They suffer from rising temperatures, climate change. They are the thermometers of the climate. I could show you this picture of what happens with a dead coral reef. And I assure you, this picture will not make you go out and buy a Tesla or buy a bicycle-powered phone charger. It won't do it. This picture might. Guam, Tumen Bay, Guam, a picture that was made in 2005. Since then, Guam has suffered an extraordinary series of coral bleaching, the most powerful set of coral bleaching in our ocean planet, in our warm waters. And this is what Guam looks like now, Tumen Bay, December. You know, when I began to shoot, every dive was a voyage of discovery and adventure. I had no idea that this was going to happen to our planet. Now, when we go into the water, we are documenting a time and a place that will change. And what we're doing is trying to document this time and a place with a grant from the National Geographic for a project we call Mission Coral, which will not only document this, but will geotag it. But I could end here and say this is the kind of cases that we have to make for the planet. But this is not an effective picture. This is. It is intimate. It looks right at you, the most beautiful animal in the world, a harp seal in the middle of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. But the ice he's on is soft ice, a product of a warming ocean and a warming planet. After we photographed this seal and we left, a storm came up from the south and an entire class of seals, harp seals, died as the ice overturned. We have to look very carefully at how we look at and how we deal with our ocean and how imagery can make this difference. I've always felt that a still picture is about memory. And a memory can be cemented now with the intimate look of a harp seal and the reach of the National Geographic magazine.
Well, the thing that excites me as a newcomer to this universe is the crosstalk that goes on here. The fact that we have psychologists, neuroscientists, storytellers, comparing and contrasting, thinking about notes, thinking about experience so far, thinking about new approaches going forward. And we saw so many examples this week. I was wondering if each of you could talk about what, from your standpoint, looking at the landscape of what needs to happen in the world as you see it in the next, let's say the next decade, you know, what's the partnership that you would love to have? Who's not on the stage, or how can we make this even further, faster than it is already? Steve, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I almost get like photography envy when I see those pictures because they're powerful, right? And it's all of us have visceral responses to those pictures.
Which neurons were firing for you?
Like all of them. Right? Yeah. So yeah, I mean, we can look at these images, and then most of us now, it was like a call to action, and most of us are motivated to do that. I want to be at a point in neuroscience where we can do the same thing and say, like, if we can ask right now, like, we can imagine what a polar ice cap looks like when it's melting. You have that internal image, right? But what does depression look like, right? Like, what does PTSD look like? What does anxiety look like? What does schizophrenia look like? We don't really have a good answer, right? Depression isn't a sad face, and it's definitely not just too little of one neurochemical in the brain. And then ditto for all these other disorders. So I think that if we can apply sort of what we've learned about the psychology about what makes an image stick, then not only can it destigmatize mental health, but we can empathize with it. And then I think that offers a tractable path forward.
Great. And Emma, you have a photographer and you have your words. Anything you dream of going forward and the way this can play out that might make things even more engaging and impactful?
Yeah, I think I'm a pretty unashamed propagandist for nature. So if we could get more research about how to be effective propagandists, I'm all for that. I love some of the research that you rounded up. Some of what I mentioned in my little talk about sort of doom and gloom shutting people down has been studied. Almost all those studies are about climate change in particular, which makes sense. It's like it's the big kind of elephant in the room for environmental problems. But I'd like to also see research about how people respond to extinction narratives, stuff about pollution. Does the same thing happen? How do you inform people, get people engaged without shutting them down? It's a delicate balance, and it's one that I think empirical research could help us to get right.
Great. And Julia, one thing that excites me here as well is platforms. The idea that we Open Explorer, which a number of people here have been exploring, is community. When we talk about community behavior, when you look forward, where do you see the innovations that are possible?
Well, I think a lot more can be done in this space, and as a behavior scientist, I would love to get more data. But before I get to the data, I would love to hear more about your own stories and your accumulated wisdom from the field, such that I can actually test those ideas empirically. And I think there's a lot more can be done, even when we intuitively know that positive stories might be more powerful than negative stories in driving behaviors of children. We don't know what kind of positive stories might be particularly useful, what kind of particular emotions that it triggers. Is it awe? Is it compassion? And so I think a lot more behavior science research can be done in this area, and that's what I'm most excited about.
So it sounds like you want more input from
Yes.
this world, which of course is very relevant because of the reality that on the ground, we're not just talking about white North American readers. We're talking about people in zones where poaching is occurring or where reefs. I was in Curacao with my students at Pace University several years ago making a film, and we heard that most of the kids in Curacao, most people in Curacao have never actually looked underwater with a mask. And so that's the kind of input you could get, I assume?
That's
great. So that's like a call to action right there. So David, what's next in that sense? Not just in terms of pictures of coral, what's possible?
We, my colleagues, myself, all the work at National Geographic have scraped the top part of the ocean. We've looked at some deep parts of the ocean that are static and not moving. But for the most part, we do not really quite understand how the engine of the Earth, this engine of the Earth, works. We need a different visual photographic approach. It may be some other idea. It may be sound. It may be something else. But right now, beneath our flippers and beneath the edge of submarines, the ocean goes on, the whales dive, and we don't really see what is really going on there. We have to communicate these things. We have to bring them back, and we have to make the images that will make people open their eyes. We have to understand our planet more, and we have to be aware of how everything is changing.
Including technology. You had mentioned that there was a critical innovation just in terms of getting a good image underwater a long time ago that made your whole career possible.
When I came here, first in 1969, underwater photographers could not make a picture of what they saw. A man named Bates Littlehales invented something called the Ocean Eye camera. It's out there right now. It revolutionized underwater photography so much that every single image that you've ever seen has its DNA based on that camera system. Every underwater system, and it was invented here. This is what Geographic can do. It can have the nexus of photography, science, vision, and hope, and exploration. And here's where we should be, and here's what is going on right now.
It sounds pretty consistent with what I've heard the mission is here going forward, so that's pretty exciting for me. It's one of the reasons I'm here, too. So now it's time for questions from the audience. If you have some energy, and I imagine I already see hands up. There are mic runners, so make sure there's one here, and then.
Hi, my name's Peter Stonier, and I've been both a filmmaker and an economist. And wearing a filmmaker hat, I've made films to lobby with that have resulted in change. But I've also been in other contexts where I've seen how the language of capital accounting and human capital is the only thing that creates a change. Very often when you go typically to so many countries where you find the rainforests, where you find the reefs that need to be protected, you have an environmental minister who is sort of the token appointee, and it's the ministers who are the Minister of Finance, the economic ministers who really have the decision-making power. And when you're talking to them, this language of capital accounting is often what actually really does move them. When you can show, don't value that rainforest at $5 an acre and sell it to a Malaysian logging company because it's actually worth $75,000 an acre when you correlate it to insurance prices that farmers are paying to preserve a microclimate. So I don't think we're in a lot of danger of people talking about natural capital to general publics. It's, I would think, more the other way around, that this is spoken of more rarely, and for that policy-making audience who read The Economist, actually it's very impressive to them when you can say that nature contributes 2.5 times to, in terms of its GDP contribution than humans do. So just the point being, you did qualify there in certain circumstances, but they are very important circumstances when it comes to affecting change.
Well,
Yeah, my guess is there's a hybrid thing going on.
Yes.
Many audiences, many stories.
Thank you so much for bringing that up, and I think that's a really important point. And I do work at the business school. I work with economists, so it wasn't meant to offend any economist. No, but I think it's a really good point, and there are audiences that would respond better to that kind of economic framing, like policymakers and CEOs of large corporations would be more attuned to that kind of language. That's how they think. And so in academia, there are some research effort on qualifying these findings by looking at who responds better to business cases versus moral cases. And we've been finding that, my colleagues are finding that the case for, making the case for workplace diversity, for example, when you use the business case for the CEOs, if they are white males, they're more responsive to the business case than the moral case. But that is not the case for the non-white males. And so we have some evidence for how you should tailor to the specific audience.
Does that say something about why it was a Chilean president who was a woman who was given a great award here last night? Is she more attuned to the broader arguments?
Could be.
Yeah, there's a question here, unless I'm missing something in the back. I just don't want to, I always miss the questions in the back.
This is fascinating and very exciting for me, and I differ with the previous speaker in terms of the value proposition of the emotional or ethical argument contrary to natural capital. I've been watching with friends mission creep in the language of the Convention for Biological Diversity and the IUCN and so on. If you look at the language, it increasingly separates the argument away from human inclination, motivation, emotion, in favor of economic arguments, which I agree do hit some of the political leaders very hard. But what is your audience? And what are the values? And what makes people change? And I think this organization in particular is on the forefront, as David exemplifies and Steve shows at the neural level, focused on the emotional, motivating effects. So for my bet, the emotional play and the ethical arguments are primary but difficult to bring to the bank. And yet, if we aren't putting our energies there, we're not going to change people. If you look at the politics in the United States, emotion, not rational arguments, are having great weight now. So I'd like to see a good balance. Think carefully about your audience, but definitely need to press on the emotional side. And I think this is a really good discussion.
Well, and I'm sure, well, David, I'm sure you would agree that, for example, with whaling, with whale tourism versus whaling, I've written about this in the past too. If you want to build the economic force, telling the story of whales, the resurgence of whales, is part of builds the impetus in the public side that creates a bigger industry that can then weigh practically in economic arguments as well. I didn't see another hand. Has anyone got a last question? Does anyone up here have a last message you want to throw out there? Because otherwise we might come in 2 minutes under. Oh, there is. Good, good. All right, Mike Runner, I can't see.
Thank you. With all this talk about natural capital, I think of Hunter Lovins and would love to see her on this stage, the author of Natural Capitalism and Natural Capital Solutions. But my question for you all, just to bring a little bit of lightness and humor, have you all seen on YouTube? It's a little bit older now. It's a parody prescription for nature. It's a parody of a pharmaceutical, and it's actually promoting nature in that wonderful propaganda way that was referenced on stage a moment ago. And if you haven't seen it, it's hilarious and it's awesome. And wondering what would be your own prescription for nature if you could produce such a video to get people outside?
Well, it's just maybe a quick sense of an image or something fun or creative you've seen that you didn't create.
That I didn't create.
Or that you did.
Well, I think that nature and what we do about it, well, it's this way. It's almost a P.T. Barnum philosophy that we should have. And it's very simple. Is the greatest show on earth is Earth itself. And this is what people come to see. And this is what almost universally people want. And this is what we have to promote. It's very simple. It's extraordinary. This planet never ceases to amaze us. And we've only really, with our great human brains, seen most of it. Yeah. The other half of it is what happens with governments and what happens with laws that laws, especially in the ocean, is what happens at the very end of the chain, in the villages, on the reefs,
Right.
on the seas. That's where we have to be as photographers, as journalists, as publishers. Right to the people, bypassing the governments, because otherwise nothing happens. It's illegal throughout the Coral Triangle and all those nations, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Papua New Guinea. It's illegal to fish with dynamite. Go to jail. If you dive in most of these places, it's like listening to the Second Battle of the Somme. Yeah. It goes on and on. We need to be right there, and we need to bring the work that we've done back. And I think that that's a key thing. That's how we change perceptions and actions in my small world, and I think it can be applied universally.
Engagement where things are happening.
Where they are.
We're pretty much out of time, but if you have your last,
I've got a real short one.
then go for
I
it.
think that it's a hybrid prescription, right? You need one part beautiful nature documentaries, flipping through the pages of National Geographic, and then for every one part of that, you need 2 parts of go outside and play, and you can't come back in until the streetlights come on.
Yeah, that sounds like a great place to wrap it up. Let's all go outside, but come back. Thank you very much. What a great panel. Thank you all.